1999. A factory floor in Bendigo, Victoria. A vehicle rolls off the assembly line that looks, at first glance, like an armored school bus. It is tall. It is wide. It is blunt, across the nose. The rear compartment seats 9 soldiers in air-conditioned comfort. There is even provision for chilled drinking water dispensed to the crew during operations. It arrived 3 years behind schedule. It cost nearly twice its original estimate. Officers who inspected it called it a battle limousine. The original order for 370 vehicles had already been cut to 299. Critics inside the system called the entire program a cautionary tale about what happens when a nation tries to design and build an armored vehicle from scratch. It looked overbuilt, overpriced, and overdue. Over the next 20 years, vehicles built at that factory in Bendigo would survive more than 120 confirmed improvised explosive device strikes across 4 war zones on 3 continents. In every single one of those strikes, every passenger and every driver would survive. 9 nations would purchase the vehicle. Ukrainian paratroopers would use it to lead the fastest armored advance in modern European warfare. It would become the only coalition troop carrier of the post-9/11 era credited by its operators with 0 blast fatalities among its crew. Its designation was the Bushmaster Protected Mobility Vehicle. The engineers who built it had understood something the critics had not. Protection is not an option bolted onto a finished design. It is the design. To understand why the Bushmaster existed, you need to understand 2 things that happened simultaneously in the late 1980s. The first was strategic. Australia's 1987 Defence White Paper described a specific threat in direct terms: small parties of foreign raiders landing by sea, operating in remote northern terrain where conventional military response would be slow and unreliable. The Army needed a vehicle capable of carrying a 9-man infantry section across that terrain for 3 days without resupply and temperatures reaching 50 degrees Celsius without breaking down. The second was experiential. Australian peacekeepers returning from Namibia and Cambodia were carrying back knowledge that would prove decisive. Southern African armies had spent 2 decades fighting in exactly the kind of terrain Australia feared. They had developed a solution, a V-shaped hull beneath the crew compartment, angled so that a buried mine directed its explosion outward rather than upward. The blast went sideways. The soldiers inside survived. Australian officers who had seen those vehicles operate came home and argued for the same principle. The procurement bureaucracy moved slowly, but the idea took root. Project Bushranger launched its competitive tender in July 1994. 17 companies responded. By January 1997, the field had narrowed to 2. The Perry engineering design used suspension technology licensed from Timoni Technology of Ireland and automotive components from American military truck production, roughly 65% shared parts with existing Allied logistics chains. The prototype was built in under 7 months. Perry's intellectual rights were then acquired by Australian Defence Industries, which launched a redesigned vehicle in November 1997 with a deepened V-hull and a fully enclosed monocoque crew compartment. The hull welded from high-hardness steel into a single structure rather than bolted together. In March 1999, Australian Defence Industries won the contract. The Commonwealth signed for 370 vehicles at approximately 170 million Australian dollars. That schedule collapsed almost immediately. Costs grew. Design changes multiplied. In July 2002, the contract was renegotiated to 299 vehicles for 329 million Australian dollars, with first delivery pushed to August 2004. The project had consumed 3 extra years and an additional $159 million. Then September 11 happened, and the Bushmaster became indispensable. The vehicle that emerged from those years of delay was built around a single engineering principle. The V-hull was not supplementary protection. It was the primary structure. A mine or improvised explosive device detonating beneath the vehicle would have its energy directed outward along those angled panels, away from the floor of the crew compartment, away from the soldiers seated above. The hull exceeded NATO STANOG 4569 mine protection standards at level 3. That protection was built into the steel itself, not added with bolt-on armor kits. Power came from a Caterpillar turbocharged diesel producing 300 horsepower. Combat weight was 15,400 kilograms. Top speed was governed to 100 kilometers per hour. Range was 800 kilometers. Every fuel line, every hydraulic tank, every flammable component was mounted outside the steel crew compartment. An automatic fire suppression system protected the interior. 3 roof escape hatches with locking handles gave the crew options if the vehicle was overturned. The cabin was air-conditioned at full capacity. Not a luxury, but an operational necessity for soldiers spending hours inside it in 50-degree heat. Large bulletproof windows gave occupants a clear view of surrounding terrain without exposure to fire. and the vehicle weighed approximately 3 tons less than comparable American mine-resistant vehicles entering service at the same time. That margin mattered more than it appeared. A Bushmaster fit inside a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. Heavier vehicles did not. A Bushmaster could operate on tracks too narrow or too fragile for 24-ton vehicles. And a vehicle that could vary its route across unpaved terrain was hard to predict. In the counterinsurgency environments about to begin, tactical unpredictability would save more lives than additional armor plate. The Bushmaster's first combat deployment was Iraq. 10 vehicles arrived with the Australian Al-Muthanna Task Group in May 2005. Southern Iraq was heavily mined. The IED threat was escalating across the entire country. The Bushmasters absorbed impacts that destroyed lighter vehicles and continued operating. No Australian soldier died inside one. The serious test came in Afghanistan. From August 2006, the Australian Mentoring and Reconstruction Task Force deployed to Uruzgan province with Bushmasters as its primary patrol vehicle. Uruzgan was among the most dangerous provinces in the country. The Taliban had been observing coalition vehicles long enough to know which ones they could kill and which ones they could not. They found out about the Bushmaster quickly. Corporal David Nicholson of the 2nd Mentoring and Reconstruction Task Force was inside a Bushmaster struck by a buried explosive in the Mirabad Valley in 2011. The blast lifted the 15-ton vehicle onto 2 wheels. Some occupants were bloodied. The vehicle was severely damaged. Every soldier inside survived. It was the 3rd time Nicholson had been inside a Bushmaster when it was struck by a device. All 3 times he walked away. The single incident that most completely defines the Bushmaster's record happened on July 10, 2012, in the Deh Rawood district of Uruzgan province. A patrol from the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment was leading a resupply convoy when the lead vehicle struck a multi-stacked homemade bomb buried beneath the road surface. The explosive had been concealed in a 20-liter palm oil container and was likely initiated by a commercial anti-tank mine. The detonation hit directly beneath the front right wheel. Private Matthew Clark was driving. He later described 2 bright white flashes, the rear door blowing outward, and dust flooding the compartment. When the noise stopped, he looked down and saw his right foot shaking. He had sustained approximately 14 broken bones across both legs. The 5 other occupants were all alive. 2 were seriously wounded. All 6 survived a strike that by every calculation should have killed them. That vehicle was later recovered, repaired, and placed on permanent display in the Anzac Hall of the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. The workers at the Thales factory in Bendigo named their robotic welding cell after her. They called her Debbie. 12 years after the blast, the crew were brought to the factory floor and stood beside the machine that had built the vehicle that saved their lives. The Dutch army had arrived in Uruzgan before the main Australian ground force, and their procurement of the Bushmaster was among the most compressed military acquisitions in recent memory. After identifying a dangerous gap between their aging armoured carriers and the explosive threat in the province, the Royal Netherlands Army evaluated 8 candidate vehicles and signed a contract for 25 Bushmasters in July 2006, less than 5 weeks after the requirement was first formalized. On September 20, a Dutch patrol Bushmaster carrying casualties from a recent engagement was struck by small arms fire, then mortar rounds, then multiple rocket-propelled grenades in rapid succession. The vehicle was immobilized. Every soldier inside survived, unhurt. With the vehicle impossible to recover and enemy forces pressing the area, a Dutch Deh Apache helicopter was directed to destroy it with missiles to prevent capture. The crew it had protected were already safe. Every man who had been inside it was alive. By mid-2008, 6 Dutch Bushmasters had been destroyed by enemy action in Afghanistan. Not one Dutch soldier died inside any of them. The Netherlands kept buying more. Then came Ukraine. On March 31, 2022, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressed the Australian Parliament by video link from Kyiv. He named the Bushmaster specifically. He asked for them by name, telling Australian lawmakers that the vehicles could significantly help Ukraine and that they would do more for common security than sitting covered with dust. Within 8 days, Australia committed 20 vehicles. They were loaded onto Royal Australian Air Force C-17 Globemaster transports, 4 per aircraft, and flown directly to Ukraine. More tranches followed. 120 Bushmasters in total were gifted to Ukraine. Australian paratroopers used them during the Kharkiv counteroffensive of September 2022, the fastest ground advance of the war, retaking Izium, Kupiansk, and Lyman at an average rate of over 7 kilometers per day. Ukrainian soldiers reported surviving mortar rounds detonating alongside the vehicle, Grad rocket impacts within 15 meters, and anti-tank mine strikes. Zelenskyy told the Lowy Institute in October 2022 that the Bushmaster had performed masterfully in real combat operations, Ukrainian paratroopers called it a home on wheels. The United States launched its mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle program in 2007, spending billions of dollars on roughly 10,000 vehicles as IED casualties climbed toward unsustainable levels in Iraq. The most produced American variant, the Max Pro, weighed 17.7 tons. The British Mastiff reached 24 tons. Both offered strong blast protection. Both were largely confined to road surfaces. A vehicle confined to roads becomes a predictable target. The Bushmaster at 15,400 kilograms could operate where the heavier vehicles could not. It could cross gravel tracks and dried riverbeds that the Taliban had learned to cede precisely because heavier vehicles were forced onto them. It fit inside a C-130 Hercules when the Max Pro did not. And because it was lighter, it placed less stress on the bridges and culverts of a country whose road infrastructure had been designed for donkey carts. The closest peer in the Allied inventory was the South African-designed RG-31 Nyala. Both vehicles descended from the same Southern African mine warfare tradition that Australian officers had observed in Namibia a decade before the Bushmaster was even designed. In April 2026, Australia announced an order for 268 next-generation Bushmasters at 750 million Australian dollars, with production beginning in 2027. The factory at Bendigo will be building Bushmasters into the early 2030s. The vehicle that procurement officials nearly cancelled 3 times over is now the foundation of Australian ground force expansion for the next decade. Over 1,300 Bushmasters have been built at Bendigo, 9 nations operate them. More than 120 confirmed blast events, 0 passenger or driver fatalities from inside the hull. A robotic welding cell in Bendigo is named after the vehicle that saved 6 men who should not have survived. 1999, a factory floor in Bendigo. Late, over budget. Widely doubted, it was overbuilt. That was always the point.